This beating heart has been the soundtrack of so many of our lives, one way or another. This heartbeat, or the thump as we've come to know it, emerging from this unit construction engine, has been around for 10 long years and in the process has revived the fortunes of what was, until 2009, a motorcycle brand limited only to the most hardcore of loyalists. In fact, not only has it brought about the revival of Royal Enfield, but of another motorcycle brand altogether, ironically its erstwhile rival, Jawa. And now, the resurrected Italian motorcycle manufacturer Benelli wants to ride this wave of fortune as well with this, the new Imperiale 400. And now that Royal Enfield's 10-year-long home run is finally being asked questions of, is it time to pick, well, a new favourite? No, that's just such a boring question. The more pertinent question is, which one of these three motorcycles can really stir things up here? This, the open road, is where you're likely to develop the strongest bond with motorcycles like these. It's in a moment here, on a rainy night or perhaps a sunny winter's morning, where you'll even find your motorcycle a name. And even if you can't be here as often as you like, you live and long to be here. Thankfully, each of these motorcycles have a lot to offer in their own interesting way. The Classic 350 is the oldest motorcycle here, and you wouldn't think otherwise even if it wasn't. 346cc air-cooled motor is the most old school of the three, with a 2-valve head and a carburetor, and is also the least powerful in this league. While many would argue that this engine felt dated even on the day it was born, the truth is, you don't necessarily need technological superiority to generate sensations and character, and that's something the Classic 350 has in abundance. But of course, many of you prefer discounted sensations over excessive vibrations, of which there is an endless supply on the Classic 350, and that means this is not a motorcycle for everyone. Well, I realize I'm 10 years too late in letting you know. But if you do mind having to roll off the throttle at 70, then you should consider the Jawa as an alternative. Unlike the other two motorcycles here, the Jawa has taken its classic bike approach rather differently. Don't be fooled by its looks, which replicate the lines of the original Jawa almost faultlessly, because the 293cc single-cylinder motor that's been detailed to obsession visually is unlike anything you'd expect to see in a retro motorcycle. Jawa's choice of an over-square or short-stroke motor with its high compression ratio tells you it wants to make no compromises in speed. It's not only the most powerful engine here by a mile, but is also the only one here with a DOHC setup, a 6-speed gearbox with a slipper clutch, and even liquid cooling. That it weighs just 170 kilos underlines the Jawa's quest for performance better than anything else. And it is the quickest and the fastest in this company. In fact, its performance characteristics are uncanny, because this is exactly the sort of thing Jawa did over 50 years ago with that similarly gorgeous but mad 2-stroke Jawa. Talk about life coming a full circle. However, its modern mechanicals come at the expense of retro sensations. Sure, it's fast, but the old Jawas were effortlessly fast. Speed felt like a byproduct of their inherent capability, whereas on the new Jawa, it's something more intended, more deliberate. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing, but what happens in effect is, when you're riding the new Jawa, you realize you're riding a wave of heritage only when you look at the bike. But for instance, if you were to ride this bike blindfolded, then you'd sort of struggle to make a direct connection between this Jawa and the one that time swept away. With the Imperiale, the sensation business is a bit conflicting because almost all of us have no real experience with any sort of classic Benelli. But engines don't lie, and this 374cc engine tells a compelling story with a really mellow voiceover. In architecture and output figures, this engine is quite similar to the Enfield's, but it feels several generations ahead in terms of its refinement and smoothness. This long-stroke motor feels almost as if it were a low-displacement twin-cylinder, and at most revs, it's very quiet. There is a lazy thrum to it, but it's almost as if it were eternally shy of being heard.
You wouldn't expect a 20 horsepower 400 to feel the way this motorcycle does, but Benelli seems to have struck gold. With a 4-valve head and fuel injection, this engine is effortless at just about any speed, and while it lacks that get up and go element, it just can't put you in a bad mood. This motorcycle is genuinely a two-wheeled cure for road rage.
But of course, not everything about it is great. The 5-speed gearbox, which doesn't get a slipper clutch, is not the most satisfying unit around. Firstly, every gear change requires a really long throw, which can get tiring if your commute is a jam-packed one. Even the distance between the foot peg and the toe pedal is quite substantial, which means those of you with size 9 feet or smaller will have to keep shuffling your left foot to change gear.
And when you do change gear, there's almost no way to tell because there's very little mechanical feel and sound from the gearbox. It's like stepping into a tub of candy floss every time you change gear, and that may not be to everyone's liking, no matter how much you may love candy floss.
But ridden back to back, to choose the best highway motorcycle of the three becomes quite easy.
Long distance riding isn't as much about outright speed as it is about being able to maintain a consistent pace with as little fatigue as possible. And in that regard, the bike that really shines is the Imperiale. The Classic 350 also does consistency really well, but at the expense of a decent cruising speed. And then we have the Jawa, which is without a doubt the faster and the more engaging motorcycle, but a high compression, short geared motorcycle can never truly make the highway its home. And while it can make the world go by in a blur, the whole point of touring is to be able to see the world, right? But what about the environment these kind of bikes are going to spend most of their time in? The city. Well, let the lightest bike in this test show you how it's done.
With 28 PS at hand and a modern, tightly packaged motor squeezed in, the Jawa is quite a zippy city bike. You can ride it the same way you can ride a Pulsar, well, almost, and its responses, be it from the throttle or the brakes, require no new learning or adaptation. The tires grip well, the brakes are adequately sharp and progressive, and it's got the mechanicals to really help you hustle it.
The Jawa is the smallest motorcycle of the three. It's got the shortest wheelbase, it's the lightest, and that seat height is accessible enough even if you're 5'7" or shorter. Overall, it just feels so compact. Absolutely in contrast to the Jawa is the Classic 350. This bike is a generation older and it feels so.
On the Classic, you have to adapt to responses that imply it doesn't really enjoy being ridden without finesse. If you are, however, a sedate commuter, then the Classic is almost impossible to beat. It's roomy, comfortable, and instills a sense of stability because of its architecture, and that's partly the reason behind its popularity as well. It offers robust ride quality as well, and comes across as something designed for Indian terrain. However, it's not as good on the brakes as the Jawa, but there is a decent amount of bite and progression available for the sort of speed you'll find yourself doing on it most of the time.
The Imperiale is the longest and the heaviest in this class. It's in fact 35 kilos heavier than the Jawa and 11 kilos heavier than even the Classic. The seat height is quite similar to that of the Classics, and that means it's not very friendly for those of you who are 5'8" or shorter, and ideally this is not the sort of motorcycle you'd want to park in a very tight spot, for sure.
One double-edged sword on the Imperiale is the soft front suspension which glides over bad roads. But it comes at the expense of swift directional changes. The rear suspension, meanwhile, is set quite stiff, and even with the preload set to lowest, it doesn't quite match the front's inherent softness. I wouldn't call it a backbreaker, but yes, over a continuous stretch of bad roads, you will find yourself getting tired. It's also the least ideal bike to ride in crawling traffic because the clutch is relatively the heaviest of the lot, and there is also some amount of engine heat that you can definitely feel on your shins.
But these are the things that set them apart. What about those things that you're going to have to learn to live with? Things that go beyond functionality and into the dimension of a long companionship that you're likely to develop with motorcycles like these.
For one, if riding with a pillion is a regular fixture in your life, then none of these motorcycles are 100% okay. The Classic 350 has a generous seat and decent suspension, but the vibrations at the foot pegs and the general lack of speed will mean you need to have someone with the patience of a monk to ride behind you, especially if we're talking long distances. The Benelli is somewhat better with an equally roomy seat, but the stiffness of the shock absorbers is going to warrant frequent brakes over a long ride. In the city, the rigidly mounted foot pegs, which are center set, foul with your shins, which can make moving it around at walking speeds quite an irritant. And then you have the Jawa, which is the least appealing of the three in this regard. That seat is just not long enough for two XL sized people at least, and because the seat is at a slant and with no real contours, it's the least long distance friendly, even just for the rider alone. The Jawa is also a cramped bike to ride over a long riding day because the distance between the seat base and the foot pegs is the smallest, so you're going to want to stretch out every now and then.
Now, if you take your long distance riding a bit too seriously, then, if you've probably already noticed, all of these bikes feature differently sized front and rear tires. So if your long distance plan involves going somewhere off-roady, then you have to carry not one but two different sets of tubes. The Jawa that we have on this test has a drum brake at the rear, while most of the bikes that will be delivered soon are going to be equipped with a rear disc. But regardless, with rear disc brake bikes and tires that are not tubeless, removal of the rear wheel in case of a puncture is quite a tedious process. So down the open road into the unknown, you have to be prepared to be at the mercy of your puncture guy. Lastly, both Jawa and Benelli don't yet have the ease of service and the availability of spares the same way that Royal Enfield does. So while Jawa is obviously a very new brand and the Imperiale is a brand new motorcycle, we do expect both of these brands to really step up their service game and bring it up to a very reasonable level quite soon.
While that concern is set a bit into the future, what will bother you on an everyday basis is the instrumentation the three bikes have to offer. The Benelli's twin pod unit is the nicest looking of the lot and is the most informative as well, thanks to the digital displays for the 2 trip meters and the fuel gauge. But the last on that list, the fuel gauge, is not the most, let's say, reliable. But at least it has a fuel gauge, unlike on the Royal Enfield, where all you get is a low fuel warning lamp that lights up when you've got around 3 liters left.
But that's still not as bad as on the Jawa. Now, it's got this really pretty, elegant instrument console, but it's just impossible to read. I can't decide what I don't like more about it, whether it's the horizontal orientation which makes you go like this every time you want to read how fast you're going, or the fact that the color schemes are not contrasting enough, or the fact that it looks like an aquarium in there every time it rains or every time you've washed it. Now, before I tell you which of these motorcycles wins, some context is perhaps necessary, no? The thing is, you buy into a class of motorcycles like these not only for the functional takeaway, but also for the emotional experience. And on that front, most of these motorcycles deliver to a very high degree. The other more fascinating thing is that all of these bikes are as analog as the modern era will allow them to be, and to be able to achieve that and to price them all around the 1.6 lakh rupee mark is nothing short of an achievement. Viewed against this backdrop, it's most commendable what Jawa has done in terms of a resurrection project. Not only did it have to deliver to Jawa purists in terms of the design, in which area it has done really well, it also had to deliver against Royal Enfield, a task that's so intimidating, nobody even dared to do it for almost 10 full years. Now, if you are someone who's transitioning from a KTM or a Honda because you want a classic looking motorcycle but without compromising on your riding demands, then it's the Jawa with its modern mannerisms and mechanicals that will impress you the most. Or of course, if you are a Jawa loyalist, then this is something that you just absolutely must have in your garage. But if you find the functionality of a motorcycle incomplete without a full spectrum of sensory experiences, then it boils down to these two, the Classic 350 and the Imperiale. Now, sure, the Classic is a very old motorcycle, but thanks to its genes, it still makes such a strong statement. I mean, it really is like one of those old, sort of hairy-chested alpha males, right? Now, in its time, we haven't really held back from criticizing it, but the truth is, this very motorcycle is the one that's responsible for the retro motorcycle movement. And it's very important to remember that an all-new generation of classics is about to come up very, very soon, and it would be extremely silly to think Royal Enfield hasn't been keeping a close eye on its competition. So the winner is obviously the Imperiale. Now, I get it, it's a bit of a shock verdict, but the truth is, as a retro motorcycle, one that's supposed to give you a substantially different everyday riding experience and one that you're supposed to be touring a lot of the country on, the Imperiale appears to offer the best sort of balance. Now, it's definitely imperfect, but it gives you these relaxed sensations that just make you fall in love with it. And while it is fairly modern in its construction, where it excels is when you go beyond the sum of all of its components. This bike feels like it's got a heart, and like few other Benellis, such as the Leoncino 500 in recent times, it feels like it was made by someone with a heart as well. Now, if I were Benelli India, I'd be extremely worried right about now, because in the time to come, they're going to have their hands extremely full.